My name is Giselle Miller, and at 32, I thought I understood the rhythms of Highland Park Medical Center in Brookstone, Georgia. As the clinical education coordinator for our step-down unit, I'd spent 4 years navigating the delicate balance between patient care excellence and administrative efficiency. The morning shift change at 7 a.m. had become my anchor, watching nurses transition between 12-hour rotations with practiced precision, their badge scans echoing through corridors that smelled perpetually of antiseptic and coffee. Highland Park wasn't the largest facility in Georgia, but our reputation for cardiac and post-surgical care drew patients from across the southeast. The step-down unit occupied the entire third floor, bridging the gap between intensive care and general medical floors. It was here that I had built my career, developing continuing education programs and ensuring our nursing staff maintained their certifications in an ever-evolving healthcare landscape. The first sign something was amiss came during a routine budget review in late September. I was reconciling our quarterly educational expenses when I noticed an irregularity in the conference attendance reports. The numbers didn't align with my meticulous records, small discrepancies that most administrators might overlook. But my background in healthcare finance made me naturally detail-oriented. Brianna Nguyen had been our step-down unit's charge nurse for 6 years, arriving 2 years before I joined the team. She commanded respect from both staff and physicians, her clinical expertise unquestionable. When she'd recommended additional professional development opportunities for our nursing team, I'd supported her initiatives without hesitation. The educational conferences she attended were investments in our unit's future, or so I believed. The Epic electronic health record system showed her badge access patterns during supposed conference dates, but something felt inconsistent. Conference attendance required specific documentation, certificates of completion, continuing education credits, expense receipts. These materials typically arrived within 2 weeks of any educational event, yet several of Brianna's recent submissions had been delayed or incomplete. During our monthly staff meeting in October, I mentioned the need for timely expense report submissions. Brianna's response was immediate and defensive, unusual for someone typically so composed. She cited overwhelming patient loads and promised to catch up on paperwork, but her eyes avoided mine throughout the conversation. The atmosphere in our unit began to shift subtly. Conversations would pause when I entered rooms, and I noticed Brianna having hushed discussions with Erin Martinez, our assistant nurse manager. Their body language suggested urgency, but when I approached, topics would shift to routine patient care matters. Mine deepened when I discovered that 3 recent conferences Brianna had allegedly attended were held simultaneously in different cities. The dates overlapped impossibly, yet expense reports existed for each event. The documentation appeared legitimate: hotel receipts, registration confirmations, even parking fees. But the timeline made attendance at all 3 physically impossible. The silence in the administrative offices felt heavier each morning as I reviewed these discrepancies. Something was fundamentally wrong, and the show was pointing towards someone I'd trusted implicitly. The professional relationship I'd built with Brianna suddenly felt fragile, constructed on assumptions I'd never thought to question. As November approached, I realized I was no longer looking at simple administrative oversights. The pattern emerging from these financial records suggested deliberate deception, and the implications would shake the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my colleagues and my workplace. The foundation of my suspicions began 18 months earlier, when Brianna Nguyen first transferred to our step-down unit from the emergency department. As the unit's clinical coordinator, I was responsible for her orientation and integration into our team. Highland Park Medical Center's step-down unit required experienced nurses who could handle the delicate balance between intensive care and general medical floors, and Brianna's credentials were impressive. Her emergency department experience had given her exceptional assessment skills and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Within weeks, she'd earned the respect of attending physicians and established herself as someone who could be trusted with our most complex patients. Dr. Catherine Williams, our medical director, frequently praised Brianna's clinical judgment during our weekly rounds. What initially drew me to mentor Brianna was her genuine enthusiasm for professional development. She attended every optional training session, volunteered for committee work, and consistently sought opportunities to expand her knowledge base. When she expressed interest in pursuing her nurse practitioner degree, I encouraged her to apply for our hospital's educational support program. The program was competitive, offering financial assistance for continuing education in exchange for a commitment to remain with Highland Park Medical Center for 3 years post-graduation. Brianna's application was stellar, and I personally wrote her recommendation letter. When she was accepted, both into the program and a prestigious nurse practitioner school, I felt proud of my role in supporting her career advancement. Our professional relationship deepened as I became her unofficial mentor. We'd discuss complex patient cases during our lunch breaks, and I'd share insights from my own educational journey. Brianna seemed genuinely grateful for the guidance, often thanking me for believing in her potential, when others might have seen just another emergency department transfer. The educational support program required participants to attend specific conferences and training sessions to maintain their funding eligibility. As clinical coordinator, I was responsible for approving these requests and ensuring proper documentation. Brianna's first few conference applications were textbook perfect: detailed learning objectives, clear relevance to her role, and comprehensive expense projections. They approved educational conference attendance and expense reports without hesitation during those early months. Brianna's post-conference reports were thorough, demonstrating genuine learning and practical application of new knowledge. She'd present key takeaways to our staff during monthly meetings, sharing best practices that improved our unit's protocols. The first subtle inconsistency appeared in March, when Brianna submitted an expense report for a cardiac care conference in Atlanta. The documentation was complete, but something about the hotel receipts seemed unusual. The formatting was slightly different from previous submissions, and the confirmation number didn't follow the typical pattern I'd seen from that hotel chain. When I mentioned it casually, Brianna explained that she'd booked through a third-party website for better rates, a reasonable explanation that I accepted without further investigation. By summer, Brianna's conference attendance had increased significantly. She was requesting approval for events almost monthly, each with legitimate educational value and clear connections to her academic requirements. The expense amounts were reasonable, typically ranging from $800 to $1,500 per conference, well within program guidelines. However, I began noticing that Brianna's demeanor changed subtly after these conferences. Instead of the energetic enthusiasm she'd previously shown when sharing new knowledge, she seemed distracted and less forthcoming about specific learning outcomes. When pressed for details during staff meetings, her responses became increasingly vague, focusing on general concepts rather than the specific innovations she'd previously highlighted. Erin Martinez, our assistant nurse manager, mentioned that Brianna had seemed tired lately, possibly overwhelmed by balancing work, school, and conference travel. I attributed her changed behavior to academic stress and increased responsibilities, but a nagging concern began to develop in the back of my mind. The turning point came in September, when I was reviewing quarterly expense reports for our department's budget meeting. Brianna's conference expenses had totaled nearly $12,000 over 6 months, an unusually high amount even for someone in the educational support program. More concerning was the pattern of her submissions. Expenses were often submitted weeks after the supposed conference dates, and supporting documentation sometimes arrived piecemeal rather than as complete packages. I decided to conduct a more thorough review of Brianna's conference attendance records. What I discovered made my stomach drop. The American Nurses Association conference in Denver, that Brianna had allegedly attended in August, was actually held in February. The dates on her expense report were completely fabricated, yet she'd submitted hotel receipts, meal expenses, and even parking fees for the incorrect dates. Digging deeper, I found more discrepancies. A wound care symposium she'd claimed to attend in Phoenix had been canceled due to low enrollment, information readily available on the organization's website. Yet Brianna had submitted a complete expense report, including a registration receipt and hotel accommodations for an event that never occurred. The most damning came when I cross-referenced her submitted conference schedules with our unit's staffing records. On 3 separate occasions, Brianna had submitted expense reports for conferences that allegedly occurred during dates when she was scheduled to work at the hospital. Our badge access system showed her clocking in and out normally during these supposed travel periods. My hands trembled as I printed each page representing a violation of trust that cut deeper than any professional misconduct I'd previously encountered. Brianna hadn't just falsified expense reports, she'd systematically defrauded the educational support program while maintaining the facade of a dedicated, learning-focused professional. The realization that I'd been completely deceived by someone I'd mentored and advocated for felt like a physical blow. Every recommendation I'd written, every conference approval I'd granted, every moment of professional pride I'd felt in her development had been built on lies. Brianna had exploited my trust and the hospital's educational support system for personal financial gain. As I sat in my office that evening, surrounded by Brianna's deception, I understood that my next actions would irrevocably change our professional relationship and potentially her career. The falsified conference attendance expenses for personal travel represented not just financial fraud, but a fundamental betrayal of the trust that formed the foundation of our healthcare team. The silence in the empty unit felt oppressive as I prepared to confront the reality that someone I'd believed in had been systematically deceiving me for months. The confrontation couldn't wait. I arrived at Highland Park Medical Center the next morning, 30 minutes before my shift, the manila folder containing Brianna's fraudulent expense reports tucked securely under my arm. The felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, each document representing a calculated betrayal that had unfolded under my direct supervision. Brianna was already at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts with her characteristic attention to detail. Watching her perform her duties with such apparent dedication made the deception even more jarring. She looked up as I approached, offering the same warm smile that had once represented genuine professional camaraderie. "Good morning, Giselle. I wanted to thank you again for supporting my conference application for next month. The wound care certification program in Denver should really enhance our unit's capabilities." The casual mention of another conference request made my stomach turn. I gestured toward the break room, keeping my voice level despite the anger building beneath the surface. "Brianna, I need to speak with you privately. It's important." Her expression shifted slightly, perhaps sensing the gravity in my tone, but she followed me into the empty break room without question. I closed the door and turned to face her, the folder still clutched in my hands. "I've discovered some serious discrepancies in your conference attendance records," I began, opening the folder to reveal the printed. "The Phoenix Wound Care Symposium you claimed to attend in March was canceled due to low enrollment. The organization's website clearly states this information." Brianna's face went pale, but she maintained her composure. "There must be some mistake. I attended that conference. Perhaps there was a scheduling change, or I also cross-referenced your submitted travel dates with our staffing records," I continued, laying out the badge access logs. "On 3 separate occasions, you submitted expense reports for conferences that allegedly occurred while you were working here at the hospital. Our system shows you clocking in and out normally during these supposed travel periods." The silence stretched between us as Brianna stared at the spread across the break room table. When she finally looked up, the warmth had completely disappeared from her eyes, replaced by something calculating and cold. "You've been investigating me," she said, her voice taking on an accusatory tone. "Going through my personal records, checking up on me like I'm some kind of criminal." "You've falsified conference attendance expenses for personal travel," I replied, refusing to be deflected by her attempt to shift blame. "This isn't about investigation, it's about fraud. You've been systematically defrauding the hospital's educational support program." Brianna stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Those conferences were legitimate educational experiences. Just because some website shows a cancellation doesn't mean the event didn't occur in some modified format." The brazenness of her continued deception was staggering. Even confronted with irrefutables, she was attempting to maintain the facade. I gathered the documents back into the folder, my decision crystallizing. I'm reporting this to administration immediately. You need to understand the severity of what you've done, not just the financial fraud, but the violation of trust that undermines everything we're trying to build in this unit. If you report this, you'll destroy my career, Brianna said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have student loans, family obligations. One mistake shouldn't define my entire professional future. This wasn't one mistake, I replied firmly. This was a pattern of deliberate deception spanning months. You exploited my mentorship and the hospital's support systems for personal gain. The conversation ended with Brianna storming out of the break room, leaving me alone with the weight of what came next. I knew that reporting her would trigger an investigation that would scrutinize not just her actions, but my oversight as her supervisor. The professional consequences would extend far beyond Brianna herself. Within an hour, I was sitting across from Catherine Nguyen, Highland Park Medical Center's chief nursing officer, in her sterile administrative office. Catherine had always been known for her methodical approach to personnel issues, and her expression remained neutral as I presented of Brianna's fraudulent activities. These are serious allegations, Giselle, Catherine said after reviewing the documents. Financial fraud involving educational funds requires immediate investigation and potential involvement of our compliance department. I understand the gravity of the situation, I replied, but I felt obligated to bring this immediately. The integrity of our educational support program depends on trust, and that trust has been fundamentally violated. Catherine nodded, making notes in Brianna's personnel file. I'll need to place her on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. This will involve our internal audit team and potentially external oversight, depending on the total amount involved. The administrative machinery moved swiftly once the investigation began. Aaron Martinez from our compliance department conducted interviews with staff members who had worked with Brianna during her alleged conference periods. The badge access logs were formally audited, and the hospital's financial team calculated the total amount of fraudulent reimbursements. What emerged was even more extensive than I had initially discovered. Brianna had been submitting false expense reports for nearly 8 months, claiming reimbursement for conferences, workshops, and certification programs that either didn't exist or that she hadn't attended. The total amount exceeded $12,000, a significant sum that had been diverted from legitimate educational opportunities for other staff members. The investigation also revealed that Brianna had been coaching other nurses on how to maximize their conference reimbursements, suggesting strategies that bordered on fraudulent. Several staff members came with concerns about advice she had given them regarding expense documentation. Diana Nguyen from our unit emerged as my strongest ally during this difficult period. As a senior nurse with 15 years of experience at Highland Park, Diana had always been respected for her integrity and clinical expertise. She approached me privately during the investigation's second week. I wanted you to know that several of us have been uncomfortable with some of Brianna's suggestions about conference expenses, Diana confided. She encouraged me to submit receipts for meals that exceeded the actual conference per diem, claiming everyone did it. I declined, but I should have reported it sooner. Diana's support proved crucial as the investigation expanded. Her willingness to document Brianna's attempts to involve other staff in questionable practices helped establish the pattern of deliberate misconduct rather than simple oversight errors. The most challenging aspect of the investigation was the scrutiny it brought to my own supervisory practices. The compliance team questioned whether I should have detected the fraud earlier, whether my mentoring relationship with Brianna had compromised my oversight responsibilities. Did you verify conference attendance through any formal process? Aaron Martinez asked during one particularly difficult interview session. I trusted the documentation she provided, I admitted. The expense reports appeared complete and professional. I had no reason to suspect systematic fraud from someone I was actively mentoring. The investigation concluded after 3 weeks with Brianna's immediate termination and referral to law enforcement for potential criminal charges. The hospital implemented new verification procedures for educational expense reimbursements, requiring independent confirmation of conference attendance and limiting the approval authority of individual supervisors. Standing in the same break room where I had confronted Brianna, I reflected on how completely the situation had transformed our unit's dynamics. The trust that had once characterized our professional relationships had been replaced by a more cautious, verification-based approach to colleague interactions. The silence that followed Brianna's departure felt different from the oppressive quiet I had experienced during my initial discovery of her deception. This silence carried the weight of justice served and systems corrected, though it also represented the permanent loss of the professional innocence that had once made mentoring feel like an unqualified good. 8 months later, I stood in the administrative offices of Riverside Regional Medical Center, reviewing the quarterly financial compliance reports that had become my specialty. The position of Director of Healthcare Financial Integrity had emerged from Highland Park's recognition that traditional oversight structures were insufficient for preventing the kind of systematic fraud Brianna had perpetrated. My new role involved developing independent verification protocols for educational expenses, travel reimbursements, and continuing education claims across the entire hospital system. The work felt purposeful in ways that direct patient care supervision never had, though I missed the daily interactions with nursing staff. The conference attendance verification system you designed has identified 3 potential discrepancies this quarter, Aaron Chen from Internal Audit reported during our monthly review meeting. All were resolved through documentation clarification, but the early detection prevented any actual fraud. The system we had implemented required conference organizers to provide direct attendance confirmation, expense receipts to be submitted within 48 hours, and random verification calls to educational venues. It was more cumbersome than the previous honor-based approach, but it had restored confidence in the hospital's educational support programs. Diana Patel had been promoted to assistant nurse manager of the step-down unit, her integrity during the investigation having impressed hospital administration. We maintained our professional friendship, though our conversations now often focused on the systemic changes that had emerged from the Brianna situation rather than day-to-day patient care concerns. The new verification requirements are working well, she told me during a recent hallway encounter. Staff initially complained about the additional documentation, but they understand why it's necessary. Trust has to be earned through transparency now. The criminal charges against Brianna had resulted in a plea agreement involving restitution and community service. She had been permanently barred from employment in healthcare financial administration, though she could potentially work in direct patient care roles after completing ethics training. The resolution felt appropriate rather than vindictive. My advocacy work had expanded beyond Highland Park to include consultation with other healthcare systems developing fraud prevention protocols. I advocate for independent oversight of healthcare financial operations, believing that the mentoring relationships essential to professional development must be separated from financial approval authorities to prevent the conflicts of interest that had enabled Brianna's deception. The speaking engagements at healthcare administration conferences had become a regular part of my professional responsibilities. Sharing the lessons learned from our experience helped other institutions recognize the warning signs of financial misconduct and implement preventative measures before fraud occurred. Standing in my new office, looking out at the Brookstone skyline, I reflected on how completely my career trajectory had changed. The betrayal that had initially felt like a personal and professional failure had ultimately led to meaningful work that protected both healthcare institutions and the patients they served. The silence in my office was different from the oppressive quiet that had characterized those weeks of investigation and confrontation. This was the silence of systems working properly, of trust rebuilt on solid foundations, of professional relationships based on verified accountability rather than assumed integrity. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. Another hospital system was requesting consultation on educational expense verification protocols. The work continued, each conversation and policy development representing another step toward preventing future betrayals. I answered the call, ready to share the hard-earned wisdom that had emerged from those difficult months at Highland Park. The experience had taught me that professional trust, once broken, could be rebuilt stronger through systematic verification and transparent accountability. It was finally over, and the silence felt earned.